In this video, I want to introduce the question types that you're going to see come up very often in the SAT reading section, SAT reading test. This list is organized from most specific to most general. In other words, the ones towards the beginning tend to be the ones that are the most specific. As you get to the middle, you get to questions that sometimes are specific, sometimes are general, in other words, about the passage as a whole. And then as you get towards the end of this list, you're looking at questions that are almost always general questions, main idea of the whole passage type questions. One other point, there are other question types. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a list of the most common questions. So keep that in mind. There could be some strange ones that pop up occasionally. And as we get more practice tests, as the College Board release more practice tests, I'll be adding on to the series to address any additional question types that seem to become more popular. This list is based on the 4 practice tests that are currently available for download, real practice tests by the College Board. The other thing is I will be returning to some of these questions in more detail, not only, of course, when we work through the passages together, but also in specific videos meant to address particular strategies and approaches that work for particular questions. So for example, we'll have a video on vocab and context question. We'll have a video on the 2-part questions. So there will be more to say about this. This is just meant as a basic introduction. Now, general point, 80% of the questions thereabouts on the SAT reading are specific. In other words, you can find the answer to that question in a specific part of the passage, not in the passage as a whole. Now, and then, of course, 20% are general. Now, this is a very fluid category because you might look at a question and it may look general, but it could end up being specific. Or you could look at a question that seems specific, but it ends up being a bit more general. So these categories are quite fluid. Just keep in mind the majority of questions are limited. You can find the answers to a specific portion of the passage, not the passage as a whole. So let's start with the most specific questions of all, which are line reference questions. These are really the bread and butter of your SAT approach because these give you specific places in the passage where you want to look, and they ask you specific questions about those lines. So these are the ones you want to do right away. You want to do these first because they're relatively straightforward. At least it's straightforward to find the answer or find the portion of passage that's relevant. It may not be as straightforward to work through not straightforward to work through what the passage is actually saying or how the choices match with that, but at least you know where to find the answer in the passage. The next specific type of question is a keyword question. These are similar to line reference questions in that the answer can be found in a specific part of the passage. The difference is, of course, that there's no line reference. But why I call these keywords is that there's a conspicuous word or words in the question that you can use to help you find the part of the passage that might have the answer. So for example, we look at this question. According to the passage, Wolf chose the setting of the bridge because it. We look at this word bridge and we say, okay, if I remember or if I can skim the passage to see where they discuss the bridge, really good chance that's where the answer is going to be, right? So the bridge is the keyword. Here, Wolf indicates that the procession she describes in the passage. So here's a keyword. If I can find the passage where they talk about the procession or even find the word procession in the passage, that might be a good place to start looking for the answer. So these are specific questions without line references, right? We don't have specific numbers, but you can use keywords to skim and search the passage for an answer. The next type of question, which often follows up on keyword questions, are the evidence questions or the part 2 questions where you have a question before, like let's say, this question right here. You'd have to find the answer to the question in the text somewhere, ends up being a specific question. And the question that follows wants to know, where did you find the evidence for that? What lines best support your answer to the previous question? And these are actually pretty nice when you've done the keyword strategy because often you found a specific portion of the text that gave you the answer, and then you just need to find the choices that match up with that. We will be talking a lot more about these part 2 evidence questions, but just for now, know that they follow up on what's otherwise a specific question. Now, the new SAT doesn't have the focus on vocabulary as the old test did, but there are questions that are somewhat vocabulary based. So the key here would be the vocab and context questions, of which there are 5 to 9 of these per test, approximately. So in these, they're going to point out a specific word from the passage. You need to find the word that best matches the meaning of that word in the context of the passage. So again, we'll talk more about these later. Function questions. So far, most of the questions we've been looking at have been detail questions. In a sense, detail questions are read the passage, figure out what the author said, find the choice that best matches what the author said, right? So it's basically paraphrasing. Whereas the function questions, these can be specific, but they can also start to get a little bit more general. These don't ask simply what the author says. They want to know why the author has said something or how the author has said something. What is the effect the author's words are having? In other words, what is the author trying to do? And you'll typically see evidence that this is a function question when you look at the choices. So here, look at this first one. The first paragraph serves mainly to. That's usually a hint that it's a function question. But notice the choices: explain, note, describe, present. These are all verbs, right? They're verbs of action. And if we're looking for a choice that describes what a passage or what a portion of a passage does, it would make sense that we would find verbs. Notice same thing here: evoke, reflect, capture, reveal. Down here, confirm, counter, support, emphasize. So whenever you see choices with these verbs, these action verbs, you're dealing with a function question, and what you want to determine is not simply what it says in the passage, but what that portion of the passage is doing. What is its function? Just to look at some other key words here, we already saw serves mainly to, mainly have which effect. That's typically a function question. And then sometimes they'll use the word functions in the question itself, right? The words in the final paragraph, functions mainly to what? And then you have these verbs as answers. Graphs and figures questions are new to this version of the SAT. Typically, they come at the end of the passage, and basically you have to read or look at a graph or a figure, read a portion of the passage or even the passage as a whole, and see how that graph interacts or works best with that portion of the passage. So can be specific, typically is specific, but also can be pretty general as well. Most of the time when you're doing questions on the SAT, you simply have to more or less paraphrase what was said in the passage and find the choice that best matches it. In infer and imply, and also in suggests questions, you have to do this a little bit. You have to be able to paraphrase the passage, but in these questions, you have to read a little bit between the lines. Now, we're going to talk more about these in detail, both when we go through the passages and a special video on these. When you're doing inference questions or imply questions or suggest questions, you are going to have to read a little bit between the lines, but do not go too far with this. You do not want to infer widely past what can be supported by the passage. And I'll talk about this later, but I'll just mention it now. What you have to remember is that even though your passage may imply certain things, or maybe you can infer certain things from the passage, there are limits to knowledge. There are limits to what you can imply or what you can infer or what can be implied by a passage. So keep that in mind. This is not a freewheeling activity. There are limits. We will talk about how far your inference can go. But of course, the key words in these questions are going to be implies and inferred. Suggest questions are similar. I mean, they're basically imply questions more or less. And the key words here will be, of course, suggest. So the author primarily suggests. The passage most strongly suggests. Those are your keywords to tell you it's a suggest question. Purpose questions, also kind of like functions questions, just a specific type, and they come up often enough to highlight them. The main keyword you're going to see here is purpose, right? The author's main purpose, the main purpose of the first paragraph. Could be about a specific sentence or about a paragraph. Could be the purpose of the passage as a whole. And again, you're going to see verbs in your choices, indicating that this is essentially a functions question. Tone, attitude, or mood. So let's define these quick. The tone of a passage or the tone of a paragraph or even a sentence is basically how the passage feels. Right? So we can see in this question, talks about the tone, and we have all these different tones, right? An optimistic tone, a dubious tone, a tentative tone, a critical tone, right? It's related, of course, to how the author feels or what the author thinks, but it's also kind of like what impression or feeling you get from the passage or the paragraph or the sentence. The attitude is more specifically how the author feels about something. Or how somebody in the passage feels, right? So if it's not the author or the narrator, if it's a character or a source that the author is discussing, just how a person feels about something. And finally, mood is more specific again, how a passage makes you feel. You're not going to see mood too often, but occasionally, right? So is there a somber mood? Do you feel somber after you read it? Is it an optimistic mood? Do you feel optimistic after you read it, right? So these questions come up. They can be specific, as we can see here. They can be general, right? How the narrator's attitude shifts over the course of the passage, or we can have a line reference, but you'll see one of these three words in the question. Assumption questions are pretty advanced. Basically, they can be, of course, specific or general, and we can see a couple of examples here. Which statement best captures Ken Dial's central assumption in setting up his research, or an unstated assumption made by the authors about Clover is that the plants what? So the key here is there's going to be some argument or belief either in the passage as a whole or in a portion of it. And the question is asking you, what is the unspoken assumption, the unspoken belief or premise that underlies that claim, that underlies that argument? Again, it's hard to, that may seem a little confusing, and we'll see, we'll work through these examples and you'll see exactly what I mean when we get into the details of it. It's in the realm of the inference, imply, suggests type question where you have to read a little bit between the lines. Dual passage questions. You'll see a little bit more than 4 of these per test, depending on the breakdowns. So there's not too many of them, but these are, of course, of the questions where you have to consider 2 passages. There's a dual passage section in the reading test. You'll have 2 passages to compare and contrast, and these questions will compare and contrast them. You might get more general questions such as this, which statement best describes the relationship between the passages, or you might see what I call a detail dual question, where they're going to point to a specific portion of one passage and ask how the author of the other passage, or even how somebody else in the other passage, might respond to this portion of the other passage, right? So it's a complex activity where you're comparing and contrasting beliefs of beliefs of the author or beliefs of people described in the passage. So again, we'll talk more about those later. Now we're getting into the really general questions, the ones that are pretty much always general. The first is passage structure or focus. So how is the passage structured? How does the focus of the passage shift? Notice this question asks for the developmental pattern of the passage. This question asks for the overall sequence of events. So here it's just getting a sense of how the passage is put together as a whole. It's not necessarily the main idea or the main argument, but how it is structured, how it's put together. Let's move on to the final one, which is main idea, which I think is self-explanatory, but you'll see things like what is the central claim, what summarizes the passage, what's the main idea, even the main purpose of the passage is in some sense a main idea question. But these are the ones that, of course, you would leave until the end, until you've done all the specific questions, and then you can go back and tackle these general questions like main ideas. So that's it for our question types breakdown. I will have a download on this page so you can have access to the list of these and know what I've talked about in this video. So go ahead and download that and print that out. Let's move on to the core strategy on how to tackle SAT reading.